TEF assessment. Now, it's important to say that it isn't particularly the case that these were amazingly insightful institutions because they were gold on outcomes, because sometimes most of that decision about the gold for outcomes was based on those metrics around completion, well, continuation, completion, and progression, and obviously those were an important part of that award of gold. But the discussion around educational gains was very rich, really, across all of the submissions, and I had to sample the submissions in some way or other. So sampling the 51 that had the gold seemed to be a good idea, in the sense that presumably most of these providers had something interesting to say about educational gains. So what I undertook was this thematic analysis of references to educational gains in the TEF submissions, and as I say, that's written up as an OFS report. So if we go to the next slide, so a bit of context. Thank you. So you may not know, or you may know, why it is that educational gains suddenly appeared as a concept in TEF 2024 when it wasn't in previous TEF rounds. And you'll recall that Dame Shirley Pearce undertook a review of the TEF, and what she recommended in her review was that TEF asks for evidence determined by the providers that addresses what our students gain from our educational experience and how we evidence that. And that turned into the OFS TEF guidelines in their OFS Regulatory Advice 22, which is what was referred to by the panels as RA 22 in shorthand. Was that in those guidelines, the OFS were asking for a higher education provider's own articulation of the gains it intends its students to achieve. So the exam question wasn't, what is the proper definition of educational gains? The exam question was, how would you articulate the gains your students are designed to achieve? And the more I looked into this, the more rational this seemed, because of course you've got so much diversity in the higher education sector. And then the second point the OFS was asking for, what's the provider's approach to supporting these educational gains, which I'll touch on briefly today, but in many ways that aspect of it is more developed. And then thirdly, any evidence, that interesting use of language, any evidence of the gains achieved by the provider's students. So there's very much an admission in the guidelines for TEF that providers at a very early stage in this sort of somewhat new concept of really thinking about educational gains. Of course, it varies a lot across the sector, the extent to which that's so. But that very final subsection of the outcomes part of the TEF was saying, do you have any evidence of the gains, of how you have actually measured gains? And that was a much more open and sometimes undeveloped section in many of the providers' submissions, and that was fine, because that was kind of what was expected. And in fact, the panels themselves were told not to pay too much attention to that final bit about evidence of gains, because it was kind of not expected that the providers would be too far down that road. Although, as we'll see, some of them are much further down that road than others. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to go straight into the findings. It's a relatively short time I have today, but obviously if you want to look in more detail, lots of quotations from the different providers on how they're describing things, then you can go directly to the OFS report. But so the first point I wanted to clearly make in the report was that educational gains are values based, and many of the providers, when they talk about their vision, the provider vision and mission, and they talk about the underpinning values, will say this is where our notion of educational gains comes from. It's to do with the values that we have, the commitment to social justice, the commitment to wide, opportunity for all, whatever it might be. And so the relationship between the values-based mission for a particular institution, and as I say, they're so varied, and the kind of range of values expressed as underpinning that mission, and the educational gains that are being articulated seem to be a very important set of connections. And then secondly, the articulations of educational gains can include, and did include, or were somewhat limited to in some cases, a set of core graduate skills and attributes. And understandably, I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, many providers, especially comprehensive providers, focused on this idea of what are the core graduate skills? Have we got a graduate attribute scheme? Let's talk about those and talk about how we might be developing those and how we might know whether students have actually reached that range of that schema, if you like, of skills and attributes. And that's a part of it. But there are important points to be made here around the fact that you can't ever write in stone a set of graduate skills and attributes and expect them to last over time. And I think a number of providers made that point. Remember Imperial College being one, making the point that if you're looking for any particular set of things to measure, then that must remain dynamic, because over time, those skills and attributes that you're looking for are always going to be moving forward. And then third point on this slide, and one that I wanted to make, I felt, I suppose, drawing on my own educational background, I wanted to make fairly strongly, and I think is valid and kind of interesting for this notion of educational gains, is that educational gains are broader than learning gains. So a lot of the work in the sector around learning gain that's happened, which I make some reference to, and I'm sure you will have heard about if you were on the call. I wasn't on the call, unfortunately, but for yesterday with Camille talking about her great work for the QAA around these sorts of things, and she's done lots of analysis as well in the past around learning gains. If you're on the call, Camille, do come in later, and put me right, and add your wisdom. But it seems to me that the use of language in the TEF of educational gains was really useful, and actually that was drawing on the Shirley Pearce's report, where she says, what are the educational gains overall that students are gaining? Now, obviously, you might say the vast majority of those gains are going to be learning gains, the things that you now know, understand, and can do that you didn't know, understand, and can do before, and the kind of affective or emotional and values-based kind of dimensions of that, in the sense that you've changed as a person. But, and I think this is important, a number of providers said that the educational gains go beyond learning gains. So building new networks, experiencing particular types of opportunities, careers-related advice and connections that are made. Those are not strictly learning. I mean, obviously there's learning involved in everything, but they're not strictly learning gains, but they are educational gains. And so I think answering that broader question, as a result of your education with us during the time that you spent with us in this provider, what did you gain? And I think that asks a bigger question than specifically how to measure points of learning, which remain very important, but shouldn't really subsume the whole space, I would say, around educational gains. So if we go to the next slide. What I noticed, and obviously you can kind of divide up all kinds of things, but by different types of analysis. But what was clear when I looked again and again at these different providers' submissions was that when providers were talking about educational gains, they were talking about some different sorts of things, and sometimes they would kind of mix them up, and sometimes they would just be talking about one of them. So I identified these three different types, if you like, of comprehensive gains, and that would come under the category of we are looking for graduate attributes in every single one of our graduates, and these include this and that and the other, and it doesn't matter what degree you do, but it's a comprehensive aim that we have, that there will be this group of gains that will be shared by everybody. Then, slightly differently from this, their identification of targeted gains. So the Open University, for example, talk particularly about the nature of their students. You know, I taught with the Open University, and it's right that you're dealing with a different range of types of students, maybe mature students, students that are working and, you know, studying at a distance and so on. So what are the specific targeted gains that you're looking to achieve for these students in this particular boat? And obviously there are all sorts of other subgroups or, you know, specific groups, if you like, demographic groups as well, including first in the family and in university. Oh, that looks like it's Camille arriving. That's great. And so there's the comprehensive gains. You know, all students in our institution should gain these. The targeted gains, we're targeting these at all of our students because they're in a particular demographic group, or we're targeting them differently at different groups within our institution. Incidentally, of course, targeted gains conceptually would include all of the intended learning outcomes for a given programme. Because if you're signed up to do, you know, medicine or a land-based degree or something, then, oh, just getting some sound from somebody. Great. And if sorry, slightly lost my thread there for a moment. Yeah, so targeted gains would include those intended learning outcomes for different programs of study, because clearly you're expecting students to learn something different if they're studying medicine than if they're studying, you know, literature or whatever. But more broadly than the program-based gains, there are other sorts of targeted gains that go with these particular demographic groups, and there are different examples within the report. And then thirdly, personalised, or you might describe these as tailored. I think I used the word tailored actually in the report. And these are gains that are explicitly curated for individual students. So in some institutions, not all, some institutions, you know, they can provide an more individualised kind of personal tutorial system that really looks at what an individual student's needs, and maybe with the help of a plan and you know, a journal or a log or some sort of way of developing those at a personalised level. And I suppose in some ways that would be the holy grail, if, you know, if resource was no object for everybody, to really personalise those educational gains. But what I found in the TEF submissions was that institutions were sometimes talking about one or more of these and not necessarily explaining clearly that these were somewhat different sorts of things. But of course, as I said, they're not mutually exclusive. So important, as I say, and this is a kind of preliminary to saying, if you're going to measure educational gains, or purport to, then it's absolutely vital to understand what it is you're actually identifying as being the gains. And as I say, we'll come back to that in a moment. And then secondly, on this slide, that clearly the knowledge, skills and attributes that students develop through their core programs of study are always going to remain central. And in some ways it's a sleight of hand, this thing, talking about educational gains through the TEF, because in part one of the TEF, which is all about student experience, which is about student education, clearly things are being said about this is the quality of our education and our assessment, and this is how we know students are gaining, you know, important aspects of their learning. But when institutions was talking about educational gains, they were sort of mentioning that and then sort of dismissing it and going on and talking about the other stuff, which you can understand why they were doing, given the shortage of space and time within a 25-page submission. But important to say, I think, that within the and it was certainly important for the providers to say that within the programmes of study, that disciplinary and interdisciplinary gains, which of course also can go beyond the curriculum itself, were important, and those were emphasised in different ways by different providers. So if we go on to the next slide. I'll be fairly brief about this because it will all be very familiar to you. But curriculum design, approaches to teaching and use of resources of all the central importance, and providers do emphasise how important these are to ensuring that students are being are enabled to have these transformative experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, co-curricular and extracurricular activities really important. So you've got this whole range of co-curricular and extracurricular activities going on at different institutions. Depending on the type and size of the institutions, these can vary in scope and type very specifically. But students do very often have a rich menu of opportunities to extend their educational gains beyond their taught programmes. But important to note in this final point on this slide, that as we all know, again, that students and particular groups of students are very differently situated with their respective opportunities to achieve these wider gains. And obviously there can be financial barriers, there can be logistical barriers for students, maybe commuting students or whatever, lots of different reasons why students are differently situated. So if we go on to the next slide. So talking about measuring gains, it's really important, given everything we've said about how gains can be differently configured, that it only makes sense to say, can we measure educational gains, when you first say, what are the educational gains we have or that we're looking for that we want to set about to measure? The complexity of a hugely diverse higher education sector, enormous numbers of different subjects, enormous numbers of different approaches to teaching and assessment, hugely variable backgrounds of students coming into different institutions, and very different ways of saying or deciding upon what these gains are that we actually want to measure, means, as far as I'm concerned, and it clearly was the case as far as providers were concerned in most cases, that there was no way, there's no rational way of, and I'd be fascinated if any of you would like to pick me up on this and disagree with me, because I'm very happy to have this discussion. But in all logical ways, I would argue that there is no feasible way of measuring every single gain made by every single student in every single context. It's just not practically feasible to do it, because the gains that students actually make are always more and different from the ones that you set about, even when you've got your intended learning outcomes, or you've got your graduate attributes, or you've got these particular set of things that you want to measure. So what can you do then in terms of measuring gains? And just hold that thought. I'm coming to the end of my sort of my talk here, and it'll be really interesting to hear you come back with some questions. But a really important point here, and I obviously do make in the report, is that particularly where people have drawn on the notion of learning gains in the literature, and for particular types of provider, what's been really important in thinking about educational gains is what is sometimes called distance travelled by students. So some providers, particularly those which perhaps don't have very large numbers of international students, and those which have a relatively sort of steady set of entry qualifications, say, well, what we've done is we've looked at the distance travelled by students coming in with particular types of qualifications, and then looking at their degree outcomes, and we're doing some measures around that. And in a particular context, that can be perfectly valid. But there are some institutions, and University of Cambridge as an example in the report, who say, we can't possibly do that because the entry requirements for our students coming in are incredibly similar, and they're all within a very narrow range. And so you get all of these students coming in with a very narrow range of entry requirements, including a lot of international students whose entry requirements is very hard to find precise equivalences within any case. And of course, degree outcomes are very broad brush degree outcomes. These, if we had grade point averages or something, it might be more feasible to do this sort of thing. So again, I would argue that the idea of doing a kind of value added, or well, a distance travelled, to be more specific, measure for students coming into their degrees and going out of their degrees using qualification, entry and exit qualifications, is incredibly complex and fraught with challenges. And again, I just don't think that makes any sense. But what you can do is, or any provider can do, is set up a series of proxy measures of some kind, which will give us a picture, and perhaps a longitudinal picture, of what's happening with certain sorts of gains. If we go to the next slide. Just a thought, just while you're holding that thought, about who can measure the gains, who's actually going to measure the educational gains. And so there's obviously a role for student. Obviously, we know that staff will be assessing learning outcomes and so on, and can have a role in assessing wider gains once they're articulated, and some sort of measurement is set up for those. But students can have a role in articulating and curating and tracking their own educational gains, and of course stakeholders and employers and representatives and so on can help to measure educational gains as well. And there are some examples of that in the report. And so if you go into the next slide, almost at the end, just summarising then ways in which gains, as I saw it, in terms of, and remember what I'm limited to in this report is the submissions by providers for TEF last year. But looking at the different ways in which gains can be measured. So you can obviously, what we're all doing is assessing learning outcomes that are part of a programme of study, or for the programme of study. That's a sort of given, that's a kind of core of learning gains at the centre of things. What you can also do is assess, for example, through self-assessment, but there are other ways as well, educational gains achieved beyond the programme of study. You can get students to create artifacts of some kind that express what kinds of educational gains they've achieved beyond the programme of study, should you have a design or in a context in which that makes sense. And as I say, probably not for all contexts. A quick plug for something that I've been recommending for quite a few years. Some of you will be familiar with my work on connected curriculum, and there's a connection here. So I talk in that book around the idea of a showcase portfolio, a kind of holistic, synoptic kind of portfolio that students can produce, and there are examples of this happening in the sector at the culmination of their studies during the time with the provider, and that can be a way of students pulling together the gains and demonstrating gains that they've made, which can go beyond learning gains to those wider educational gains. Then, of course, you can develop specific schemes to assess an agreed selection of graduate attributes. That's perfectly possible as well. And you can, as mentioned earlier, you can design proxies for the distance travelled where this is feasible, given the entry qualifications or initial assessments. And then what I didn't put on this slide, but kind of, as an important part of this, what a number of providers have actually done is created a kind of set of key performance indicators, or one provider I think referred to as an educational gains index, by saying we are going to put together a basket of measures, and it's going to include these particular learning outcomes, which are core to all of our programs. It's going to include these particular questions on the NSS, an additional bank of NSS questions. It's going to include this, it's going to include that. And we're going to put that together and make a kind of educational gains index, and that's going to be used as our sort of proxy for measuring educational gains. And I think that might be the last slide. Rosie, I should know this, shouldn't I? Yes, my concluding thoughts. So my concluding thoughts in the report are that there is no single sector-wide approach to defining and measuring educational gains, and either proposed by the TEF or by the providers. And I'm fascinated to know whether Camille's work has led us towards something further that might come closer to a kind of agreed sector-wide way of actually doing this. But notwithstanding the fact that this certainly was not the case, that there was no shared one-size-fits-all notion of educational gains through the TEF exercise, what I think was important was that articulating these wider gains and really exploring them was an important sort of corollary really to the sort of let's just stick to the metrics and, you know, how many students went on to graduate level jobs, etc., because that doesn't tell the whole story at all. Talking about educational gains in a more qualitative way, in a richer and deeper way, tells a much better story as far as I'm concerned, I suppose, of coming as a qualitative researcher to you. A much richer way of actually thinking about what educational gains are. And as I say, in particular contexts, you can say, we are, for the purposes of our needs at the moment, we are going to look at these particular educational gains and we're going to measure them in these ways. But as I say, articulating gains reflects the benefits to the students that are deeper and wider than qualifications, graduate employment, and the other sorts of metrics that TEF focuses on. And I think this is especially so where the notion of educational gains becomes core to a dialogue between the students, between other stakeholders, and obviously staff of all kinds in all roles in our higher education institutions, that really can get together as part of a sort of creative, values-based opportunity to say, what is it we're doing here? And how can we make sure that students have the richest possible set of outcomes in their fullest sense during their time with us? And how can we assure ourselves year on year that they are achieving what they want, what we want, but most importantly, what they want, of course, and what employers and others need as a result of what we're actually providing. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to you coming back with some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dilly. Thank you. It was a lovely way of sort of setting off sort of the oversight of this presentation, as it were, and on this topic. And I think it's nice that Camille's joined as well. So just to reiterate, anyone who's joined during Dilly's presentation, sorry, if I can get my teeth in, we're going to take the next presentation and then have questions after that for both speakers. So if you just want to hang on to questions for the moment, please add them to the chat and we'll pick them up after we've had our next case study. But Dilly, thank you very much indeed. That's really set the scene beautifully. So now we move on to Professor Kristyan Spelman Miller, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education at Keele University. Kristyan has been Pro-Vice Chancellor since July 2021. She has many years of experience, having held senior positions at the universities of Liverpool, Reading and Winchester prior to joining Keele. She leads on transforming the educational experience through inspiring curriculum design, teaching and assessment practice, and excellent learning environments. In 2022-23, she served with the Office for Students as a Teaching Excellence Framework panel member, and she is a strong advocate for the importance of students gaining international perspectives and learning opportunities outside of the classroom. And we're delighted to have Chris today to talk about educational gains and emerging case study. So thank you very much indeed, Chris.
Thank you very much. And again, I think Libby's going to control me from a distance with just the opening slide. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to join the group today. It's really nice to see many familiar faces and names, and really looking forward to the discussion. In fact, I think rather selfishly, this is probably going to be particularly helpful for me as we continue to move through our thinking around educational gain. So really looking forward to the conversation later and following on from Dilly's presentation. I seem to have lost on my screen at least the opening slide. So I don't know, Rosie, if you're able to pop that back on again.
I just thought that I'd lost it as well, Chris. So I think we'll just get that back.
Thank you.
There we go.
Perfect. Yeah, lovely. So I think I just wanted to sort of start with the following the experience really of the recent TEF. What, from an institutional perspective, the opportunities that we had really then to which we didn't fully appreciate at the time, really, to step back and reflect on who we are as an institution, how well we are geared to the learning experiences of all of our different students, really to dig beneath the metrics, as Dilly has just articulated, to arrive at that much more rounded and truer understanding of our strengths and weaknesses as an institution. and really to search for and triangulate the evidence from many different sources. And this is particularly true, I think, in our attempt to address the challenge of educational gain, looking at the whole array of things that we have available to us in terms of qualitative and quantitative information, to really build that truer and richer picture of educational excellence. And I think the experience certainly around educational gain, as we all institutionally were struggling with the exam question, if you like, was to do that stepping back and the connecting of a fairly disparate set of activities and data which we naturally collect as part of our institution around student success, but to allow ourselves then to put everything out on the table as a bit of a buffet, really, and then through the process of submission towards the TEF 2023, to then decide exactly where our focus is and what that should be. So I'm going to be talking a little bit as a case study here. It's very much an emerging case study of that process and that journey that we went on for TEF 2023. But also ongoing now as we move into the next iteration of TEF, how we are thinking through. So there's a little bit of showing our workings here, and I hope that may be useful as a very genuine and honest reflection on some of the challenges that we've got institutionally in trying to identify, as I said, from the buffet on the table, exactly how we're going to move forward in our understanding and sharpen up our focus. So I thought just before I move into that showing our workings from a Keele perspective, I would just, for the benefit perhaps of those who aren't very familiar with Keele, say a little bit briefly about who we are. So Keele, as you can see from the map, is in North Staffordshire, midway between Birmingham and Manchester, and very close to Stoke-on-Trent. We're a largely campus-based institution with 13,000 or so students, with the dominant course offer being undergraduate, very strong foundation provision, and a growing range of other offers around degree apprenticeship, short courses, skills boot camps, etc. A small amount of PGT online, and also TNE. And we're actually a pre-92 institution, a dual intensive university with disciplines across 3 very diverse faculties, from medicine through natural sciences and arts, humanities and social sciences. And we refer to our positioning really as part of the golden triangle, or quadrangle, I should say, really, of 15 universities in England that perform highly on both teaching as a gold awarded institution in TEF 2023, but also with high research intensity in the most recent research excellence framework. So just on the next slide, a quick word about our population. These are old data now, but just to demonstrate the kind of diversity of our provision, as I've mentioned, largely undergraduate focused, very small international, and in terms of demographics, a very even distribution across here. I've demonstrated here with a polar 4 quintiles, about very much spread across those the 5 quintiles. About 40% of our UK intake is actually very regional, from the West Midlands, with about 35% or so from Black, Asian and mixed ethnicities. So that's us in terms of our kind of constitution, if you like. Just on the next slide, just to give again you a little bit of a visual image. We are very much campus based. This is a promotional slide really, so it is beautiful. It's actually a glorious campus. 630 acres of parkland and stately home, solar farm, and a number of lakes, etc. So we focus, as the next slide also suggests, very much on community, a very strong sense of physical community as well as you know, our broader diverse communities which may not be actually on campus. And then again on the next slide, a very strong commitment to sustainability, and that will come out, I think, in one of the areas of values that I will talk about in a moment around our educational gains. So then just moving into TEF, I put a couple of slides here which are probably very familiar to everybody in terms of the kind of learning that we've done following TEF 2023. The opportunity that we did have to reflect on our strengths and weaknesses and ambitions, and really the kind of action planning that I think we've probably all taken forward. Before we had our results, we actually set out a whole set of areas and themes where we had recognised that we needed to make improvements, and in all of these areas we are moving through. And the next slide also continues that kind of list of areas which I'm sure all of us are very much engaged with in terms of our next enhancement plan for our institutions. And I've included this because I think perhaps in all of these, one of the key areas for us was actually embedded in that number 16 on the slide there. The ability to understand deeply the starting points, behaviours, experiences of our students, and to be able to measure that at various touch points through their journey of success, obviously very much links into what we're talking about today in terms of our approach to gain. So I'm going to focus a little bit now on our approach there, as I say, to show a little bit of our workings and to talk through some of the decisions and choices that we've made to make a manageable approach to measuring gain and to make that work for the future. So in the next slide, like many institutions, I think our strategy, you know, it articulates in the sense success across those dimensions of academic, personal, and future success. And I think we wanted to keep coming back to the fact of our commitment to the diversity of our students and of their courses and the disciplines that our students are studying on, but keeping at our heart the focus on that range of different academic, personal and professional development opportunities and success measures that we want to instill in our approach. So again, like many others, and the next slide demonstrate this, we have approached our student success through a framework of graduate attributes. This graphic just demonstrates the baskets of attributes, the key headings, the main headings of attributes, that we have 4 of those, which we use very much, and we weave through the fabric of our programme offer. And of course, those are then demonstrable through the learning outcomes, the achievement of learning outcomes on our programmes. But also we use these graduate attributes to talk about the wider student experience. So for example, in planning our induction activities for welcome, pre-arrival and welcome, we use these graduate attributes as the basis for describing the wider benefits and experiences that our students will gain from being at the university. And so these 4 areas of academic expertise, professional skills, personal effectiveness and social and ethical responsibility, and that social and ethical does relate very much back to sustainability, as I've mentioned, as a key value which the institution is promoting. So I think just reflecting on the use of graduate attributes, not unusual at all in setting that as the basis really for how we want to go about describing the success across our students' experience. But I think what we hadn't really done until TEF 2023 was to systematically gather evidence really about what our learners, whatever their starting points, how they were going to be gaining those beyond the achievement on their courses. And so the opportunity to really think, what are we focusing on, and how are we going to measure those specific areas of attributes. So our thinking then led to, next slide, from these four areas of graduate attributes. You'll see in the next slide, we've identified, selected out specific attributes or areas of each of those four categories, which we feel are true and key to the educational experience at Keele. So we wanted to identify those which were meaningful, as well as being measurable and trackable. And these really focused on the professional element that we wanted to instill through our provision and experiences. Digital as being, again, a very key area of development that we see as part of being very much about being effective in both academic senses and also professionally for the future. The importance of global and social awareness, and linking back very much to our values and mission. And then finally, the academic confidence and growth that we expect our students to achieve. So in those areas, again, the next slide just unpacks a little bit more how we are, oops, sorry, slipped again. Thank you. How we are going about identifying particular areas for measurement. So we have just been going through a major curriculum redesign project, and that gives us the opportunity, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, to ensure that all of our provision has a focus on skills development from both academic, personal and professional perspectives. And this is often through explicit modules across all years in the provision, which emphasises the development of experience, and that includes a lot of focus on experiential learning, placement opportunities, but also in curricular experiences around assessment and employer briefs and project opportunities and so on. And also an opportunity to reflect, and reflection, personal reflection, is now provided very much as part of an increasingly significant part of the way in which our academic, personal and professional skills development is assessed in our modules. We also have, which Dilly has also mentioned, an academic mentoring or personal tutoring process, which, together with the availability of this skills development focus in our curriculum, gives us a really important anchor point for us to be able to track and measure the gains around these four areas of growth that we are identifying as our educational gains. So for each of those, I'll just very, very briefly say something about them. And as I say, in some cases, we are already very much, we have data we are measuring, and it's very much instilled in our processes. In some of the other areas, it's much more evolving, and there's work to do to ensure that by the time there's the next TEF, that we have a more rounded approach to the actual evidence base that we will be able to demonstrate. So I'll take the first area, and that is really on the next slide, around the global and social awareness. And I wanted to mention this because this is an institutional project to introduce a curriculum pathway to the vast majority of our undergraduate students at Keele, who can elect or take one of 6 elective pathways, and they're listed here, which are all linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they cover, as you see, social justice, climate change, global health, etc. And through this offer, over all 3 years of the undergraduate programme, students take part in one of these global challenge pathways. It's a 15-credit module at each level. And through this, and in particular through our quite extensive offer around languages, we see the opportunity to develop both interdisciplinary and global awareness and sensitivity to social and global positioning, if you like, of an individual, and the skills that are developed through these mechanisms, to really widen horizons for students who are studying often single honours provision. And this is a really important strategic project for the institution, and one which is pervasive because it's institution-wide. We have a very wide uptake, an unusually wide uptake of language study, and now an increasingly growing commitment through global challenge pathways to the development of interdisciplinary, often very applied, very collaborative activity, project-based and experiential work, which is a great opportunity really for us to demonstrate, and then to be able to support students to develop that global broad awareness. So that's on one of our approaches that we're taking, which is very much true to our intentions and our mission. Secondly, on the next slide, like many universities, I'm sure, we embed career registration, career readiness as a key area that allows us to revisit each year with our students the stages of their professional skills development, and to help them to plan. Again, these are very much tied into both academic mentoring processes and into the skills modules which are available throughout the provision, the curriculum. So again, I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. At Keele, this has been running since 2017, that all undergraduates engage with the questions that are possibly a little bit small there on the screen for you to see, but allows us to identify and then to link to their own planning for the future, the state of readiness around these areas of decide, plan, compete and sorted. The next slide demonstrates how we translate that into then material that students work with. So against each of these areas of stages, if you like, of their own professional development, how well ready they are in terms of their decision making around career planning. Each of these areas then links to resources and planning that they can build up over the course of their study. And the next slide again demonstrates what that would look like for students who, for example, are clicking into resources that they can then work through and then build into their skills development module, and work with their academic mentor to support their development. So these self-assessment tools and resources together enable them to build their professional development plan, which allows them to work through stages of their readiness for work. I think the next slide just demonstrates the kind of questions. Oh, sorry, no, I moved on to the next one, which link to each area of development. So then, yes, finally, or thirdly, the digital area. This is the third of the areas that we're looking at. Very excitingly, actually, this is really building on a long-standing approach that we've had to our commitment to measuring digital capabilities. We have developed at Keele our own platform, which is called My Skills Progress. You can see just a snapshot here, which launched just over a year ago, institution-wide. There had been piloted before then. So My Skills Progress is a tool, a mechanism whereby students can understand their progress with respect to their digital capabilities. It allows, through a set of questions, as we've got here, self-assessment, and then link to categories of resource that they build up. So the next slide, I think, will show the radar map that the report will provide on the basis of student self-assessment of their skills and readiness around generally around their digital capabilities. And then the next slide will show again how for each of those areas there are resources that students can work through on the basis of their need, and this will link then to various sort of certified activities and the presentation reel, the curation of a digital portfolio which students will then have around their skills development. So this My Skills Progress is actually, was already in place, and we were able to report on for our TEF submission. What we've decided to do is to expand My Skills Progress and the same kind of concept and framework for us to capture the fourth of those areas that I had on the original slide, of 4 areas that we're working on, and that is to build a picture of academic confidence and growth. So we're going to be, and this is where it's still work in progress, using the same structure and building it in through My Skills Progress to develop this strand around self-assessment and reassessment reporting and links to resources to measure students' confidence and growth around their academic expertise. Again, using My Skills Progress alongside the other mechanisms, as we said, career readiness, we're able to embed this both in the core curricula that we have focused on skills development, but also through the academic mentoring process to have an opportunity for that personalised discovery process, if you like, and planning that can go on an individual level. So
just a minute to go, Chris.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up. Last slide,
Perfect,
actually. Yep, last slide really just sums up a few concluding thoughts. Firstly, that decision making about what is meaningful and reflecting what we feel is the mission for our students, and students themselves feel is important. That we've decided to build very much on existing processes. We've got plans to do more, but we're not over promising really in terms of the range of different tools that we can employ, and we want to keep it fairly simple and streamlined as something that we can build into our processes. So to make sure that can be an institution-wide approach to tracking. So we've again focused very much on embedding those 4 areas very clearly in our core activity. And then finally, in terms of gains, looking to triangulate across other data sources, complementary data sources, to understand whether or not we are succeeding and how well we are succeeding in providing the gains for our students. So we use a number of external as well as internal surveys and records that we will use to complement our tracking of our students' progress. So I'm going to stop there because that's exactly where I wanted to finish, and I hope that just gives you a bit of a warts and all approach to how we're trying to approach educational gain from Keele.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Chris. That's really nice, and I think it's a lovely way to continue after Dilly's presentation to give us that real example of what you were doing beforehand, what you're doing sort of since, and also those lessons learned. I think it's really quite nice to capture those, because I think that resonates with a lot of us in other institutions.